Well, much more now on the terrorist threat as we mark 12 years to the day after the 9/11 attacks. It's important to remember that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi citizens. How many of them can you name, right? When you really think about that, it's pretty unbelievable. Very few of us can. A lot of the funding for these hijackers came from Saudi Arabia. And today, strong financial support still flows from inside Saudi Arabia to hotbeds of radical Islam around the world. But they're not the only ones. There's a lot of big players in this region, and we wanted to talk a little bit more about it with Jonathan Schanzer. He's a former terrorism analyst at the Treasury Department and the vice president of research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And so, Jonathan, we wanted to talk about this today because after 9/11 happened, this was part of piecing the puzzle together about how this all came about, who supported these guys, who funded them, and how they were able to achieve what they did. Now, as we move forward today, who are the big funders, where's the money coming from, and where is it going?
Well, I think it's worth noting, first of all, Jenna, that, there was a great push at the Treasury Department. Part of the 9/11 Commission included a report about terror finance, and we did conclude that a lot of it did come from Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries. We successfully designated a number of charities and went after a number of the top financiers. In many ways, we've become victims of our own success over these last 12 years. In other words, we've driven a lot of these charities and funding sources underground. They're now operating through bulk cash smuggling and other illicit means that make it much more difficult for us to track, whereas before we would be able to actually freeze bank accounts. And so we're still looking at Saudi Arabia. We're looking at some new players like possibly the Qataris and other Gulf countries. And again, this is, I think, still the epicenter of the terror finance problem.
Where is the money actually coming from? We say, some of these oil-rich countries. Is it coming from business? Is it coming from government? Is it private fundraising? How much money are we talking about, and where is it truly coming from?
Well, we're still talking about tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, depending on the individual and the country. Most of this, in fact, I would say at this point, almost none of it is going to come from state coffers. That is the last thing that the Saudis, for example, want to do, or the Qataris want to do. These are allies of the United States. They took it on the chin after 9/11. There was a lot of scrutiny, and so the last thing they want to do is cross the United States in that way. And so our understanding is that the so-called golden chain that existed back during the 1990s of individuals who are interested in financing terrorism are continuing to do so. They're just doing so in a more quiet fashion, and again, in ways that make it much, much more difficult to track, making the job of the Treasury and the CIA that much harder.
So let's talk a little bit about it in relation to Syria. Syria, the civil war there has been going on for 2 years, and we know there are some major players that are supporting various components of that civil war. What is that doing to the bottom line? For example, is Syria's civil war really affecting finances in Iran beyond the sanctions that the United States has placed on that country? Is it really affecting any of the other players? Is it having a dramatic economic effect on any of them?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we get the sense that the Iranians are single-handedly financing Syria. They're trying to keep the Assad regime afloat. It is basically a sinkhole, and if there's any positive aspect of what's going on right now, it is certainly draining Iranian resources, especially as they're under sanctions right now for their illicit nuclear activity. We are hearing that the Saudis, of course, are involved in funneling a lot of money to the opposition. Obviously some of the money is going to the FSA and some of the so-called vetted groups, but also there are a lot of concerns that it may be going to the Nusra Front or to the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham. ISIS, as it's known. We are also hearing, I'm just back from Qatar and Turkey, that some of the funds that they have been providing to the so-called vetted opposition is also trickling down to these al-Qaeda groups as well. And so there's a huge amount of money going into Syria to fund and arm and train these opposition groups, and some of them are of course, going to al-Qaeda.
Jonathan, to pick up on a conversation we had last hour with Ed Hussein, he was saying that we really need to invest more in the right groups overseas to counter the terrorist narrative. Let's use that in Syria as well, just as a conversation point. Could we match the money going into Syria? Could we actually invest in the right people in Syria that would avoid having to go through the Russians and avoid also having to put boots on the ground? Is that something that we should consider more? Is it worth the investment?
Well, I mean, we could. It's certainly a possibility. I do question the utility of it. I think Americans are tired of throwing money at the problem, throwing resources at the problem, certainly tired of putting boots on the ground. I mean, my response to Ed Hussein's piece would be to say, listen, why don't we just find allies, not frenemies? Why don't we work with countries, that are actually willing to ensure that there's a moderate version of Islam that is spread throughout the region? That would exclude the Saudis. That would probably exclude the Qataris and several other allies of the United States. This frenemy concept is I think, really working to our detriment right now.
A lot to think about today. Jonathan, thank you. We appreciate it as always.
My pleasure.